Chapter 34. Sin. Ernest F. Kevin pointed out some years ago that God's law defines sin. It follows, therefore, quote, "If there is sin, there also must be law, for sin is transgression of law." 1 John 3:4, end quote. God's law is much more than a legal code. It is covenantal law. It establishes a personal relationship between God and man. For this reason, disobedience to God's law is regarded by the prophets as adultery, as a betrayal of a close union. It is thus much more than breaking a law or violating a statute. It is the most fundamental kind of disloyalty one can commit. It is a personal affront to God the Lord, a betrayal precisely where the most intense loyalty should exist. The biblical Hebrew word hesed means loyal kindness, loving kindness, and even love. Chesed presupposes the covenant, a relationship where man should manifest the most intense kind of loyalty. The word occurs 128 times in the Psalms. Quote, "Chesed is eternal," Psalm 105, 106, 117, 135, characterized by fidelity. Psalm 84:11, 88, 137:8, immensity, Psalm 32, 35:6, 56:11, 102:11, 107:5, fullness, Psalm 35:6-11, and reveals God's beneficent saving spirit, Psalm 6:5, 30:17, 53, Psalm 97:2-3, which, quote, hails the saving quality of Hesed, end quote, is, quote, the liturgy's Christmas song to celebrate the birth of Jesus, which means Saviour, end quote. In addition, the divine Chesed is marked by humility of love, quote, which stoops to equality with his beloved and even to the lower self-abasement of the, quote, form of a slave, end quote, Philippians 2:7, end quote. Consequently, God showers his Chesed upon the poor and humble, Psalm 67 and 71. The omnipotent power and justice that mark God's Chesed, Psalm 61:12 following, make it possible for God to give victory to the weak and poor and to laugh at the futility of creature self-exaltation, Psalm 2, 36:13, etc. Simultaneously, God is quick to pardon, Psalm 29:6, end quote. Chesed on the part of man means faithfulness of men one to another and towards God. It means the knowledge of God and the fear of God. It means, quote, religiosity, piety, kindness, and love of mankind, end quote. It means mercy and compassion and more because it expressed a loyalty to the covenant, and it is an expression of covenant life. On God's part, Chesed expresses his covenant fellowship. It expresses his covenant grace in helping us. In Micah 6:8, God's primary requirement of man, in Moffat's rendering, is, quote, to be just and kind and live in quiet fellowship with your God, end quote. This is, quote, God's first inescapable requirement that the Israelites do, quote, justice, end quote. Hebrew mishpat, a common term for the legal norms demanded by the covenant. The second requirement of Micah 6:8 is to love mercy, or to be kind, that is, chesed. The curses pronounced in the Bible are for contempt for and disregard of God's law. One does not escape the curses by denying the law that proclaims them. Pietism has tended to reduce God's relationship to mankind to a non-covenantal and purely personal one. Abraham knew better. In Genesis 18:17 following, God tells Abraham of the impending judgment on Sodom and Gomorrah for their wickedness. This Abraham does not deny. His concern is with the innocent. Will they also be judged? God answers Abraham saying that he will spare Sodom if 10 righteous men can be found. Judgment must come, but a righteous element upholding justice can avert it. Responsibility is not purely personal. We have a responsibility to the country and the place of our residence. The law speaks to our total life. Thus, in Deuteronomy 21:1-9, we have a law regarding a murdered man found in a field. The city closest to the dead man must assume responsibility for his death. If the murderer cannot be found, then a heifer must be sacrificed to make atonement for the unsolved murder. In other words, every wrong must be righted. If not on earth, then God, in his judgments in history and at the last judgment, will complete the righting of all wrongs. What this tells us about sin is that it is a very personal affront to the triune God. An impersonal status law is constantly broken, often with impunity, and the many violations are in time forgotten, because perfect enforcement is not even dreamed. God's law presupposes full and perfect enforcement. What God does not complete in time and history is enforced in hell. The necessary requirement of justice is restitution, recompense, repayment. Disbelief in hell means in time a disbelief in justice and a pessimism with regard to history. God's covenant with man is not only a gift of law, but a gift of land. Tenure on land is normally in return for covenantal obedience. Thus, to despise and disobey God's law is an invitation to displacement and captivity. Associated with this is God's curse upon covenant breakers by means of bad weather and natural disasters, drought, flood, earthquake, etc., and by means of an inflicted judicial blindness. Blindness to God's law is blindness to reality.